very glad to have with us this morning two persons. The head of our department, Dr. Anne-Marie White, is here, and also Jack Brennick, who is an outreach worker at Delphi. And as I was about to say, Delphi is, as I remember, is kind of a multi-purpose outreach center. Deals a lot with drug addiction, addicts, and also families and incarcerative situations. We are asking Mr. Brennick to come to discuss to us what he does basically relevant to the ex-incarcerate and how the service he provides to families of persons such as this is meaningful. Both the positive aspects of what he does and the negative aspects. If we can just follow through, this class verbally, we had a great deal of intercourse on Monday, back and forth, and they came up with some tremendous statements, comments from both experience and from study. So we're hoping that you will ask as many questions as time will allow to our speaker following his presentation. Looks as if he's ready, and I'd like to present to you now Mr. Jack Brennick, who is very much involved with a very, very important and forgotten service to our community. Before you get started, one time, if this goes back to the mid-1970s, it was after the Attica uprising, at one time there were at least seven agencies in our city that dealt primarily with persons coming out of prison and their families. And now we're down to about, I guess, what, two? We're down to about two now, aren't we?
Yeah, you know, if I was good with all the hierarchy of who does what, I kind of listen to the people who I speak to, and yeah, it's dwindling down, I know that, and yeah.
Yeah. So even something you used to call pre-trial release, that's almost a thing of the past now, but all these things are very functional, but they've been lessened tremendously. So what we'll do is we'll hear from Mr. Brennick now, and he will share from us off the top of his head what he wishes to with respect to our coming together.
Yeah, I gave a couple of handouts. I'll kind of get to those. Let me, yeah, my name's Jack Brennick. I am right now aside from being the domestic violence coordinator, you've got some information in front of you that's connected to domestic violence. We've been running domestic violence programs for men at Delphi since 1998. 99% of every single referral has been court-ordered, mandated. So that became my immersion into incarceration. So right now, I still run the domestic violence program, but I've also become the on-site clinician, they call, for when the program's called prison reentry. So sometimes I say that to people in the community, and they go, "What do you mean? They're going back to prison?" You know, because doesn't the language sound like that? But it's really leaving prison, re-entering into the community. But I guess that's too complicated of a sentence. So prison re-entry, and that means returning to the community. So how about community re-entry? I don't know. Instead of prison re-entry. And so I'm the on-site clinician. We've got case manager people. And those are people who arrange for, so when someone gets out of prison, jail, a lot of times they don't have access to resources. So we've got case managers that provide access to resources. A facilitator, like getting appointments at DSS, finding apartments, and some of the people returning from prison got some pretty heinous crimes, so the community is a little bit suspect of putting them anywhere. So we have to be thinking about where to put this person, murderers and sex offenders are what I'm talking about. And there's you know, those people, that particular population, if they got out of jail, they probably did some long-term period in jail, and they went in front of a parole board who said, well, okay, we'll take a chance on you out in the community. So then they come to us. Then I got further boxed in. Well, I'm not saying I got boxed in. I sort of chose this path. There's a section of all these people coming out of prison that also got mental health problems. And the fancy word is SPMI, serious and persistent mental illness. SPMI, serious and persistent mental illness. This is not just the kind, I'm depressed because I got arrested, or frequently in this domestic violence program, I'll run into the flyer here, I'll run into men in not so much trouble who say they're depressed because they got caught. Not because they hurt somebody, but they're depressed because they got caught. But now I'm spending a lot more time with SPMI, prison, history, and then how to fit them back in the community. So I am on site at our little facility on 727 St. Paul Boulevard, right next door to the DSS office. And that's a nice location for access to resources, because now we've developed relationships with some of the people in DSS who can make things happen very quickly. DSS, if anybody went there today and handed in an application, they'd say, you'll hear from us in 4 to 6 weeks, which is more closer to 45 days, not closer to 4 weeks. 30 days is like, it's probably going to be 40 or 45. And then at 45, they have a legal mandate to be responsive. So we've run into people that can make things happen a little quicker than that. That's these diligent case managers. But sometimes some of the, and the primary gender is men. We have women incarceration, we have women clients, but the bulk of the population is men. So we got gender, and then if you want to go one step further, we also got color. Who's got access to resources in this culture? So there's a whole race part that plays into this. And it became, I'm always kind of aware of it. And you know, the dominant, it's non-white. You know, there's our share of white guys who show up, and then there's a share of Latino, and probably the bulk is African American, black. So I like to believe I'm dialed in, but we just began so this is how my time gets chopped, according to the person that writes my paycheck every 2 weeks. 3/4 time with the mental health SPMI population, 1/4 time with domestic violence. Lucky nobody counts the minutes, because there's a lot of overlap. And then none of it's built in for this, right here. But no one's gonna go back and call me to account. I mean, they're gonna ask what happened and how was it. But effective response requires community coordination. Effective response requires community coordination. So that's what this is. And so I will argue all day if someone wants to bicker with me back in my office about, well, Jack, that class was only supposed to last however long, you know. So if somebody wants to mince my minutes, so I leap at the opportunity, especially with you after we had the briefest conversation. And there was something about the vibe that I felt from you. I'm glad you recognized something in me. That there's some important conversations we need to have in this culture, in this society, around this all these things that I'm talking about. I just want to do something, and this is a little bit similar to like what I do in the class. I call these not all the mental health clients. A lot of the mental health clients have domestic violence history, meaning, especially the men, they've been perpetrators at one point. But once I started to dig my claws into trauma, there's this real high correlation between childhood trauma and future, this is regarding men, real high correlation between childhood trauma and future perpetration of domestic violence. And this, yeah, I'm seeing some of the, yeah, I didn't always know that. I would get that from some of the attendees in the class. The very first domestic violence class I taught was in 1989. I went to a training sponsored by a judge and a women's shelter I was living in the Hawaiian Islands at the time. And they showed me this curriculum, which has been rewritten a couple of times. It's a very good curriculum about talking about interrupting domestic violence. And more than once, men had said to me, back then, Jack, you just don't get it. Because I'd go in there and I'd say, well, it says on page 13 that you should probably be having more empathy toward your wife. Okay, we're done with that section. Now we're going to explore respect for 30 minutes. And on minute number 31, I'm turning to the next page. You know, because there was a lot of supervision around it. It was new stuff. So I just wanted to hear from everybody. Let's just go around and say first name. Tell me one thing about your motivation for being at this class. Yeah, don't give me a dossier. Just, you know, sort of your first name and your motivation for being at this class. Okay, let me just leave it at that. Is that enough instructions, or do you need more?
Okay, I'm Pat.
Hi, Pat.
I'm in this class because I've always been involved with children in the school system. I have a son that was incarcerated, is now out, and so I have a lot of ideas and a lot of experience about what is going on, and I thought I'd take this class to see what I can do to increase my skills and what's out there to be more collaborative.
Thanks, Pat.
My name's Jess.
Hi, Jess?
Yeah, I'm
Hi,
a
Jess.
senior. I'm going to grad school for public policy next year, and
For
public
pub-
policy. And so, but I
Like
can
that.
do something with it. Help.
Yeah. Good enough. Thanks, Jess.
I'm Casey.
Casey?
My motivation for taking the class, I don't know, it was the first time the class was being taught, and I really liked the topic.
Thanks, Casey.
My name is Ahmed, and I'm actually a fellow colleague of Dr. Taylor.
I think I've seen you before. In this. Maybe running that thing. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I'm here because I want to soak up his wisdom. I think he has a lot to offer as an elder in the community. And in regards to the topic of incarceration, I was incarcerated for over 3 years. In between prison, probation, and parole, I have 14 years under my belt in the system. So I'm very well seasoned when it comes to on the other side of it, and being a scholar, studying it, being someone who's actually assessing it through the lens of someone who's been through it. I think I have a unique perspective.
Thanks, Ahmed.
Hi, I'm Crystalline.
Crystal?
I am a public health major, and my ultimate goal is to study the spread of infectious diseases. And so I'm taking this class because both physical and mental health have worse outcomes in poor neighborhoods, almost always. And I thought this class would be an interesting way to explore that.
So as you speak, I'm thinking of the
Psychosocial. Yep.
Biopsychosocial.
Yep.
Just throwing spiritual there. I got coached
Yeah.
on that one a while ago.
Yeah, spiritual.
You're missing that one, Jack. Oh, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It needs to be there.
Thanks.
Nice.
My name is Sam, and
Sam.
I'm a double major in public health and psychology, so this is pretty much fits all my interests. I'm just kind of trying to learn more about like the biological and the social like ramifications of mental health like in oneself and like how people develop it. So like this would be a good place to learn about it.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what state you're from.
I'm from Kentucky. Hello.
Do we wear hats in May on the derbies?
Oh, always. The really, really big ones.
My name is Taylor. I
Hey, Taylor.
am a freshman medical student conducting research here in Office of Mental Health Promotion. And my research is focusing on the Black church and millennials and how we can use gatekeeper models in order to really impact mental health issues in the church.
Gatekeeper models. Look at you throwing around
So,
some kind of term. I've been accused of being that. This guy's just a gatekeeper. So I'm like, well, he's right. Yeah.
so the reason why I chose to join this class is because we did touch on the topic of the Black church and how it's been a lot in the community. And then also I think that this class will be important for when I am practicing my position.
Thanks.
My name's Lisa. I'm a
Lisa.
public health major, and I wanted to delve more into like mental health, which is not as much touched upon in our public health major. So
We had one student to come in. We're going around giving first names and wanting to know why you took the course.
First of all, I want to
Welcome.
thank you. I want to apologize for like disrupting. I'm sorry.
You're here. You've arrived.
Um,
So your first name?
Anna.
Anna.
I'm Anna.
What's your motivation for being in this class? Like what, you know,
I
you took it because,
well, when I saw
or your major, or, you know, any of
when I saw the course description, it really interested me because I'm an EMT. I've been an EMT for 2 years.
that. EMT?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was a first responder. I was doing that before. I've been involved in EMS in some way or another for 4 years in June. And during that time, I've seen a lot of, well, obviously a lot of people with mental health issues.
Mhm.
But I noticed, that the hardest hit is, the poor community and people that are uninsured or underinsured, and I don't really know what I want to do with my life, but I know that I want to learn more about like the specific problems facing the poor community and specifically like the poor minority community, because I think it's there's a gap, there's like a services gap, and I want to know what I can do to help fix that.
Thanks for being a first responder. Can you just pass it down? I'll just catch up real quick. I got invited by Dr. Walker here. He's coming and talk after we briefly met, and I have a lot of work these days in Delphi Drug and Alcohol Council's prison reentry program, community reentry program. This is gonna bug me.
Sounds pretty good.
I'm gonna have to get that from one of my good supervisors, this woman Ann Graham. She's the queen of prison reentry, at least in Monroe County. So she would be able to coach me on why it's called that. And it might just be some very benign, rather than some deep explanation as to how that. So I started in all this as a school counselor. And I was, took psychology in undergraduate because I didn't know what else to take, and the Vietnam War was nipping at my heels, and my father being a World War II veteran, he says, you're not going in the military. That was sort of atypical. That was the one thing that was not very masculine about everything that he represented. Like, because all the guys in my neighborhood, you get to work or get in the military, and my father's like, you are not going in the military. He says, you're going to college, and I'm like, yeah, school, what a school. So, and then fast forward, I become a school counselor, and I was that school counselor that started to develop a reputation for the wild boys who did things in classrooms that were creating problems for teachers, creating behavior problems in classes. And I was that, my last name's Brennick, but no one ever remembers that. So it was always Mr. B. I don't have any cards. I didn't bring cards. I'm looking through what I got. So you'll have to remember that guy, Jack Brennick. And the kids would get sent down there before they get sent to the principal, go see Mr. B, go see Mr. B. And I don't know what it was, because, you know, I had books that I'd read and training, and, you know, and I'd find myself in face-to-face with some, there was girls, but the majority was boys. And I'd be saying stuff like, well, stop doing that. And they'd be like, you know, the teachers, well, we tell them to stop, but he doesn't listen. And I'm like, well, I also called his parents. And they said, oh, what'd they say? So I was that counselor that also called the family. And so I try to recruit some assistants, because, you know, I knew these wild boys didn't have to listen to me. Like, stop doing that. Is that the best advice you got, Mr. Counselor? There'd be other things we do, you know, go for a walk around the campus, and, you know, count to 10. I don't know, have them in some arts and crafts activities sometimes. Go see Mr. So-and-so down in the shop, he'll take you in, come back and see me before you go see your math teacher, write a letter of apology. Those are a bunch of little things we would do. But the big thing was calling the parents, and it wasn't long that I figured out, wow, the apple doesn't fall far with some of the responses I would get. You know, not all the parents were like, gee, I am really glad you called me. Yeah, you know, I'll get to my child immediately, because a lot of times it's like, what are you calling me for? What do you think he's like at home? And I'm like, oh my God. So fast forward, I got approached by a women's shelter one time. I knew nothing about domestic violence, nothing. I hadn't even heard the term. This is 1988. And it was sort of percolating in the country, but there wasn't any laws. It was long before O.J. Simpson, if anybody remembers that. And so this women's shelter got burned down. And I remember it got burned down, but I didn't know what it was. I thought it was some center where hippies hung out, you know. And the place where I lived in the Hawaiian Islands was a little bit, one of the outer island spots. It was kind of rural, and, you know, I was more involved in the beach, and, you know, I worked as a school counselor. And then this women's shelter gets burned down. I get approached within a couple of weeks by the women who ran the women's shelter and said, we heard that you're good with working with boys. And I'm like, okay. They said, well, we got a program we want to do with men. 26 weeks. It was called the Alternatives to Violence Program, ATV. They show me some stuff like this. And it's once a week, and they were supported by some judge, and I'm like, men, I'm good with boys. And I said one of the most naive things I ever said to a group of women who ran the shelter. I didn't really know them. And I go, I'm good with boys. What have boys got to do with men? And that's what I said. So I was like, and they kind of rolled their eyes, and they're like, okay, we can teach this guy maybe a couple of times. And, you know, I ended up taking this because they were paying me what seemed like forbidden wages. At that time, the minimum wage was $8 an hour, and they were going to pay me $40 a group. We have groups today, I pay the per diem, we pay the per diem instructors for 90-minute groups, $50. So since 1989, the pay's gone up $10. But I was like, $40 a group, that's a lot of money per hour. That was only once a week. But what came along with it was an absence of supervision. It was a brand new program. The one person who backed it was the judge. So then the judge always told me, you get any trouble in this class, come and see me. I was going to that judge every 2-3 weeks because the pushback for having to come to this program back then, a domestic violence program, was incredible. And the causes for them being was not, I don't have with me, I have one, I want to show you. Have people seen the power and control wheel? Has anybody seen that?
I think it works.
Well, I'm going to show you a copy. Oh, it's in here someplace. They showed me this. It's on the cover. It's these little wheels, but they're bigger when I hand them out. It identifies behavior that's abusive and violent, and it identifies an alternative, a solution. So we're looking at things like not only physical violence, we're looking at intimidation, threats, isolation, privilege, minimization, denial, and blaming, using children. In 1989, everybody who got mandated to a domestic violence program was all physical violence. There was no conversation about non-physical aggression. Today there's more of a conversation about non-physical aggression. And it was then that I started to pay attention, because all of the men who came had already been to jail, they'd already been to prison over whatever it was they did, and then when they came out, this was their re-entry. Go see Jack, the guy that runs the class, for 26 times, once a week. You gotta be there on time. I was thinking about that as I'm getting here at 10 after 9, and I'm like, oh my God, if this was my class, I wouldn't let him in. So, yeah, they gotta be there on time, they gotta pay their money, they gotta be respectful, they gotta watch their language, they gotta speak one at a time. There's a whole bunch of guidelines around that. But back then it was just all physical violence, and now the community has grown in understanding that this violence is more than just physical, it can be non-physical. And then, fast forward to just maybe in the past 10 years, have people heard of the ACEs study? That thing's real. That's real. By a guy named Felitti. Dr. Felitti, PCP, primary care doctor out in Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. He developed the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. It's the simplest, I say this cautiously, it's the simplest survey, meaning it's only 10 questions. It is not an MMPI that requires a computer program to tabulate. And the answers are either 0 or 1. So the lowest score a person can
Ladies
have
and
is
gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The impending tone indicates that the hospital is participating in a hospital incident management system drill. Please do not be alarmed. This is only a drill.
She said they weren't
Okay, I'm glad she warned us though, because if she hadn't warned us, I'd be freaking out.
So let's talk about sights and sounds that might trigger trauma.
Well, for Crystal, it's an alarm.
The impending tone indicates that the hospital is participating in a hospital incident management system drill. Please do not be alarmed. This is only a drill.
It's interesting, these are ones that sign it, they should sign one line, they should sign another one.
Well, before I moved into the prison reentry section of Delphi, I've been with Delphi since 1996. So before I moved into the prison reentry, I was at the outpatient clinic 2003 to 2016, so however many years. Every 3 months you got in a fire drill, that's one of those regulations, so something would happen. They usually warn us all. And that could be during group time, so you get, there's a lot, it's a busy little outpatient facility. And yeah. Anyway. But where was I going with all this? It's just a little bit of the background on what put me where I am. Oh, the ACEs study. I started using that, especially after having a conversation with, I got a sharp colleague who works over at Mount Hope, a guy named Justin Rosati. He's working on his PhD. Anybody run into Justin yet? Take a class with him if you can. He's out of the psychiatry department, but he's working at Mount Hope. He's doing long-term effects of childhood trauma. They got longevity studies over at the Mount Hope Family Center. They got PET scans. They got MRI. They got neural pathways. They're talking brain development and altered brain development because of trauma. And this is sort of rooted after Felitti, Dr. Felitti, out there, just started asking questions differently. It began with women. This is 1998 when he first started testing out his ACEs survey, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. 10 questions, yes or no answers. It's either yes or no. And so a high score, over 5, he says, you're starting to get into the possible area of PTSD. People answer 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that kind of stuff. He said anybody might get a 3 or under. So, anybody taking it, oh yeah, that happened to me. And, sort of suggesting that we do have this resiliency factor that we can bounce back from trauma. But Dr. Felitti started saying, he was meeting with women at the outpatient clinic, at the primary doctor clinic at Kaiser Permanente. They're like the West Coast version of Blue Cross Blue Shield. They're out west, they're out in Hawaii, they're out in, west of the Mississippi, large healthcare organization. But this guy, he was noticing that women more than men, and it's not that it happens more to women than men, it's just, the old stereotype, which just might be true, men don't ask for help as readily or as quickly as women will. You can have a long conversation about that. But it started with women who were presenting with these problems that seemed to have no family history, or nothing that he was identifying. The fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, I don't know, the list goes on and on of things that he was spotting. Body pains that wouldn't be read in an MRI. Sharp pain across my thigh, what is that? So he started asking, what happened to you, instead of what's wrong with you? And he started coaching people to do that. And so then we come up with this phrase, trauma-informed care. So that is where I am at today in terms of moving back to that conversation about men, moving back to the conversation about domestic violence, moving back to that conversation about prisons, trauma-informed care. And the first thing that I think has to happen is safety. That little go-around that we just did, if you find yourself in a therapeutic group, that does wonders for establishing safety. Just that whole little thing, people introducing themselves, and you guys did wonderfully, but sometimes when you get mental health clients or people in a lot of trouble, they're not even sure what they want to say. So just to say their name and how come you came today, that kind of stuff. It's the beginning of establishing safety. So that's what I'm very mindful today when I walk into my office after I leave here. Because my calendar, if you looked at my calendar, you might say, Jack, what are you doing today? Anybody remember, got any Seinfeld fans here? George Costanza was one of the characters. He worked for the New York Yankees. No one ever knew what he did. It's sort of like that. Somebody came in and said, what are you, Costanza? And it's like, but when these mental health clients come into our office and sometimes you hear bad news about DSS or your SSD got, your SSI got denied, or your landlord doesn't want you living there, or Time Warner cut off your, any kind of bad news, they start escalating immediately. So I'm sort of on duty all the time. Do I have to call an ambulance right now? Do we have to pull the trigger on a mental hygiene arrest? So I'm that one who's sort of charged with that duty because no one else wants to do it. It's completely frightening sometimes, and it has to be done very mindfully. And anytime the police or the firemen show up or the ambulance shows up at our office, knowing that all our clients have all been to prison, there's a possibility they might just go back, like right now. So I'm thinking about that as we speak. Like, oh my gosh. So I do spend a lot of time coaching our staff about countertransference. It's probably too long for me to even explain what that is. But it's when it's clinician overreaction, probably the short version. So I have to remind myself about countertransference. Am I overreacting? And I have to make sure I'm not underreacting. I frequently joke around saying I have to get hit with a 2x4 before I know there's a dangerous situation going on. But people keep asking me to come back and do this, and people keep asking me to come back and meet with these clients, and sometimes I get called in just to sort of be there while they discuss how much can you afford in rent. Because that could be a trigger. This is all couched in a background of guaranteed trauma. I just saw the movie Moonlight. Have you seen that movie yet? It won a bunch of Academy Awards. It's not your Hollywood feel-good movie of the year, but somehow won a bazillion Academy Awards. Very important movie. But there's a bunch of sections there on the effects of trauma that were just waking me up to, how trauma affects somebody's life. And so, all right, that's snapshots of the things I'm involved in right at the moment. This is just a group activity that I will bring on any given day, especially when we started the class at the jail. We started a DV class over at the Monroe County Jail. Domestic violence class, when I say DV, domestic violence. And that's 2 days a week. And we haven't gotten, I started this in November. Now, I don't bring this out every session, but we haven't gotten to page 2 yet. We're still on page 1. This is all men. Occasionally there's a female staff that comes in and sits with us, but this is men in jail. So we've got a lot of topics here that get men discussing. And there's an especially important message in this whole thing. This is requesting honesty. And I think men have been given a pass on honesty in our culture, frequently, when it comes down to intimacy. And so I have to watch out for it. And so just asking men to be more honest about, and it seems to work a little bit better when we're in the jail, because a lot of them are like, what am I going to do when I get out? And, how am I not going to come back to jail? So those are just some of the pieces. I don't know, if it raises questions, thoughts, observations, I mean, I could go through our curriculum, I could explain our little flyer, but, I mean, all of you got sort of your bailiwick. The Hawaiians call it the kuleana, your area of responsibility, the thing you're dedicated to. And you had your hand up, then we'll kind of move around.
I was wondering when you were talking about if I guess your clients start to sort of escalate and you feel the need to call for outside
Backup.
police. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you find that either EMS or police, you know, if because I guess they know that they've been in prison, right? Do they come in with kind of a mindset like, oh, we want to send them back? You know, have you noticed that at all?
It depends on who shows up, because they're all on parole. All of them, most of them, they're all on parole. So somehow their parole officers, they got scanners or something? I heard the call, like I got a call, because we called, the EMTs, the fire department, they seem to be, what can we do here, what do you need?
Yeah.
The police tend to have a little more muscle, plus guns are showing. And then when parole comes in, it's like you brought in the SWAT team. So they tend to defer to whoever made the call. So I'm usually the first line, and I'm like, I think this person's got to be removed. I said, can we wait a few minutes? Can we keep you guys outside the door? Can we see what happens? And then I have to deal with, not deal with, but I have to be mindful of staff, because the person behind the desk, you talk about first responders, the secretary, right? Haley. She's the sweetest toast, and she gets paid, I don't know what, and she's definitely not trained. She's not paid, and so she's the first responder. And she's like, Jack, I think you ought to come up here. I'm like, okay, Haley, just sit back. You know. I don't know, is that the sweetest marmalade? I don't know, sweet as, yeah, me and my metaphors. So, yeah, but I don't have, when we make a 911 call like that, we don't have it's sort of who's in the neighborhood. But parole eventually shows up when we're calling in. There's a bunch of different codes. There's a 951, that's mental hygiene arrest.
Right. Yeah. I've been.
I don't even know all these codes. The case managers know them. They guide me a little bit. Yeah, good. Tell me your first name again.
Sam.
Sam, yeah.
Yeah. So this whole session is for men in recovery. Is this talking about men in addiction recovery, or like recovery of their own domestic, their like own childhood issues, or like recovery of their?
Yeah, that's a question.
I mean, it all goes together. But is this like when people get referred to your program, is this because they have been an abuser, or is it because they have been abused, or because they just need a little bit of help?
The primary, if we're talking about referred, in the jail, the staff picks out, the jail staff has seen all this.
Mm-hmm.
They've poured through my little 26-week thing, they've read this, they've looked at, and they pick men to come in. Now, I don't necessarily always know this is in the jail. Fast forward to the community program. If they got domestic violence background and parole now, I mean, I don't know if you got caught up in this. Parole is if you were 17 years old and the neighbors called the police because they heard you yelling at your girlfriend, and now you're 40. Parole is tracking that down and say, oh, you got a domestic when you were 17. You better go to 26 weeks.
They do that all the time.
Now,
So-
we do discuss the trauma with respect to families and parole officers. We haven't gotten there yet. But before this particular phase ends, we'll be discussing that.
Casey, right?
Yeah, good memory.
Some. It's hit and miss.
So I have two things I want to say. One is with the parole officers. So When you're working in the community, like
Yeah.
that is a huge trigger. If you tell someone like I'm gonna call you parole officer, that's like the biggest fear somebody has, because that can, even
Yeah.
if they've been good for like 10 years, like that
Right.
can throw like literally everything off track. So I guess like if I was in their perspective and like I was worked up about something and like there was talk of somebody like that was gonna be called, I would just like leave. I would stop wanting to seek help. I would completely shut down and just be like, well, I'm gonna tell you what you wanna hear, and then just move forward, because of that fear. Because when somebody's emotionally responsive to something, if they're having an emotional reaction, it's because of something more. And so, I don't know, I feel like, especially with the mental health services in Rochester, they really aren't efficient at all. You get put in a room, you eat animal crackers, color a picture, and then they like don't really help you. So,
So harsh.
Attention all staff. The emergency operations center
that
is
was the
now
one
open.
thing. And then the other thing, I was
ATF
wondering
A and
if when
B,
you worked with
extension
the one in
50500.
county, if
Attention
you ever
all staff.
experienced
The emergency
pushback and
operations
fear
center is
that
now
you may
open.
have to
ATF A and
respond
B,
back to
extension 50500.
the officers, not because you are one, but because you're a staff member and in their head, you're all the same.
That hasn't happened. I'll go backwards and I'll start with the jail question first. Only because that we've been trying to. We just began this jail program. You know, I've been doing the domestic violence classes very specifically since 1989. The mental health portion of my work began in 1996, but the jail just began in November 2016. So I had that worry the very first day. I don't have it anymore, which doesn't mean it's not in the back of my mind. The men who attend the community program, not so much the mental health program, who come for, it's got an even more curious name, supportive forensic housing. So if you took forensic out of it, supportive housing, that's really what they come for. Housing, financial resources, they get a TOPS gift card once a month, they get bus pass once a month. They've been selected by the Office of Mental Health and the Parole Board. The forensic piece is because they're also in mental health. They all have a psychiatrist, they all have a therapist out there in that community, whether they're eating animal crackers or drawing pictures.
No, I just mean the mental health hospital.
Yeah. So, but the jail, the men in the domestic program, not so much the mental health program, the domestic program are the ones who give the most pushback. I don't belong here. How come you don't have a 5-minute grace period? Why do I have to pay? What does this topic have to do with domestic violence? We were talking about respect for the past. It's called becoming respectful. This one man who says he's in recovery, like from drug and alcohol, like 12 steps, AA, and he's got some power in the group. He's got some leadership skills, and he says, "What's this got to do with domestic violence?" And I said, "Maybe you should just sit and listen." That's all I said to him, because it was like the other men were not thinking along those lines. But that's where the pushback comes from in terms of I don't belong here. In the jail, so we've trained staff to deal with that level of discontent.
How do you train them?
Lots of conversations like this. Yeah, I don't know, I got a handout that says beware of the traps of collusion. This might be how I'm dressed a lot of the time, but occasionally I'm all suited up because I got to go to court sometimes. And I happened to be in a suit one time, and I was doing an interview with a man who showed up in a suit. And he was a white guy. And he had some things in his briefcase. And this is what he does. He says, so, do a little role play here. You be him, I'll sort of give you your lines. He said, I'm sitting there and I'm saying, so you got to come to the program. He says, so, you got a program for somebody like me? And he does this. And I'm like, I got a program that meets at Tuesdays at 4:30. He says, well, I nearly lost my shirt in the .com boom. And I said, well, I'm thinking in my head, well, you're going to be in a group with a guy that nearly lost his shirt in a bad crack deal. I don't know. I'm like thinking, what is this? This is the collusion. And he says, I don't know, I don't have a lot of identifying things around my office. Like, I don't have the picture of Disney World. None of that. If you walked in my office, you might ask, am I leaving or moving? But I don't take this off. And there is a conversation about that in law enforcement about whether you... So this means, oh, I must be married. So he says, so I notice, he goes, does your wife like macadamia nuts? And he pulls out a 1-pound bag of dry roasted, salted macadamia nuts. Well, I just got off the plane. So the fact that he says he just got off the plane, I knew that he could afford to pay the $700 for this respect program. Anyway, go ahead. Amen.
Okay, there's a couple of things I want to mention. Okay, the first thing is, have you heard of the term hood disease?
Hood disease? No.
Okay, so hood, it was coined by Harvard psychologist or psychiatrist, if I'm not mistaken. But
Good term.
It's more so of it's a term that's related to those who experience PTSD in the neighborhood, and it's a constant war zone. So, and unlike someone who's coming from war, it's worse because they're constantly going through this every day. They walk to school,
High
so on
level
and so
of diligence.
So it's called
hyper vigilant.
Hypervigilance, but on a whole nother level because they have to deal with this every single day.
Yeah.
Like basically from birth. So they call this term hood disease. And I was wondering if
I've never heard that.
If that was actually connected to this adverse childhood experience survey. I was wondering if it does. That's one thing. And another thing I was thinking about is
yeah. Briefly, yes.
Okay.
It's one of those questions.
All right. And another thing I was thinking about is in regards to those who are receiving treatment for domestic violence.
Right.
2/3 of the cases of domestic violence actually come from law enforcement officers. Law enforcement officers are more of the acute, like the higher population.
The offenders, you mean?
The offenders, exactly, that are offending for domestic violence. So I was wondering what type of treatments are being provided for the law enforcement officers that are accused of domestic violence.
Yeah. Is there do we have I think the way you're talking about it, I think in terms of a hierarchy, right? So a hierarchy, the people at the top, in a hierarchical, we have many systems that have hierarchy. Education, military, churches, schools, and sometimes even families, which I present to the men. That could be a problem if you're thinking you're at the top and your wife's in second place. But, so now you've got people in positions of power, the way you're describing, who have permission to misuse their power. And this is rare. Do we see law enforcement? I've seen some law enforcement officers come through our program, and occasionally they'll get taken back into the fold, the police fold, if they go through the class, and sometimes they've been set out. Their badge has been pulled and they're rogue. So, but it's very rare, less than once a year. And I typically say to them, you probably shouldn't advertise that you're a cop. I'm thinking group safety. Just because of the we're back to countertransference again, group countertransference. And it's hard to coach a group on countertransference. there's a lot of safety rules built into that whole, if you want to call it that treatment thing. But yeah, the law enforcement part, they are exempt from scrutiny sometimes.
You know, it just bothers me because, you know, you may have a lot of law enforcement officers arresting people for domestic violence, and they're beating their women at home. And they're putting handcuffs on people.
Well,
that's, you know.
I had the very first day I walked into the jail, reminded me, which was in November 2016, 6 months ago, reminded me of the very first class that I walked into in domestic violence in 1989, that group of men, when I finally agreed to teach the class for the women, and it was all military guys. And I'm holding up this wheel. This is terrible, I should have had copies. This is the power and control wheel. And this wheel says coercion and threats, intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, using denial, so using physical violence. So I'm in front of a group of military men in 1989 holding this wheel up saying, this is bad. And it's kind of like, I always said there was a dozen guys there. I always said that was the group of 12 Angry Men. There's a famous movie from the 50s, 12 Angry Men. And it's sometimes I sort of think in terms of thirds. 1/3 of them are just going to be very cooperative. 1/3 are going to be a little on the fence, but not too oppositional. But we'll give you leeway, Jack. And then there's a third that are just going to be a little bit defensive, and that's what I was getting in this class. 1/3 that were just, and then the class had an MP at the door with a gun, walking in. This is on the base, and I'm like showing them. So one guy stands up and he's got all his uniform and he's got his stripes, and this is '89. He was a Vietnam era vet. He was now in the reserves, and he said to me, "So Jack, intimidation, threats, physical violence, you know how I got these stripes? U.S. military taught me this." This is in the class. I'm like, "We're on a military base. You allowed to be talking this way?" But the door was closed and I had already gone through confidentiality. And I suppose what he was saying was not a threat to harm, threat to self, and he wasn't hurting kids. So I'm like, okay, he's not violating the confidentiality rules, but listen to the way this man is talking. He says, "I got these because the U.S. military." So you're saying I can't do this? I shouldn't do this? Anyway, yeah.
I was, I was thinking when you were saying like the power and control wheel. That's kind of a lot of those things. Intimidation, threats, use of physical violence. That's like the law enforcement playbook. And
You got it.
I completely agree that it doesn't.
You got it.
It makes sense to me, and it doesn't make sense to me that it makes sense to me that especially police are going to be more likely to be domestic abuse because there's a really high rate. I think in EMS too, there's like a really high rate of like maladaptive ways of coping. But it's a problem because they don't get punished for it because they're in our society, I guess there's this tendency to put cops, and fire and EMS kind of first responder on a pedestal, and they don't always get scrutinized for their actions when they shouldn't. It's this like divide, and that needs to, in my opinion, that's fundamental, and that needs to change because, and that's also why I asked you, when you called.
I've never been allowed to do trainings with the police department. They don't invite me. But I have been allowed to do trainings with probation. And I did do a training recently with parole. That was a breakthrough. That was just like a breakthrough.
Excuse me for breaking in, but this will have to be our last comment.
Oh,
because we're right at the threshold of being 10:15.
Okay.
I just wanted to
Pat,
say,
go ahead.
yeah,
Thanks for being patient.
Oh, that's okay. Maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, the Department of Psychiatry had a contract with the police department and the fire department. And it was the Officer Assistance Program. That's when Dr. Cedric Alexander was here, was completing his fellowship and then came on faculty. And he did a lot of the officer assistance programs with the police and the fire department. And although those, let's say, files were closed, just by the types of people that came in, many of the police officers, it was domestic, there were domestic violence cases on board. And, you know, I don't know what the outcome was, but definitely they were referred for that. And him being a marriage and family therapist, you know, when you see the officer come or the person come, and then the family is there, and then extended members of the family are there, you know that he's dealing with the issues of domestic violence. So, and I don't know why the contract didn't continue.
Let me respond to one of the statements before we leave.
Yeah.
One of the students in this class, in their first papers, titled her paper "Kill or Be Killed."
Mm-hmm.
So we wonder why would they want the military? Why would they want to subject personnel to situations such as this? And I remember that when I got out of the Army and went to get a job, there's another veteran right in front of me, and I could hear what they were saying. And the woman, during the interview for his position, said, "Did you learn any skills in the military? What skills did you learn?" And he simply told her how to kill people. And that was it. That was almost like a psychiatric evaluation to me. But
Right.
it was an employment interview. Simply, I was taught how to kill people. And he was absolutely right. Everything you learn in the military is how to kill. Nothing else. How to kill. And I think that does show some inconsistency with respect to wanting to have something relevant to domestic violence or other types of acts of violence on the military, within the military framework, because it's kind of inconsistent.
Well, if somebody's not burdened by the trauma of that, because I've had to talk with military, former military, who sort of callously say, well, they just got to leave it on the field. So, easier said than done.
Well, we certainly want to thank Mr.
Oh,
Brennick.
thanks,
Can we
sir.
give short?
Thanks for tolerating the conversation.
Now, class, remember now, next week, no class.